It was 10 o'clock at night on a humid Friday when Edward parked his imported luxury vehicle in front of the bustling regional hospital in downtown Miami. Through the rhythmic sweeping of his windshield wipers, he saw Rachel hurriedly enter through the main sliding glass doors, carrying a worn canvas backpack over her shoulder. He sat there in the driver's seat, wondering what she was doing at a medical facility every single week, and why she felt the need to lie to him about her secret whereabouts. Edward took a deep, steadying breath and stepped out of his vehicle, absolutely determined to uncover the hidden truth about the mysterious woman who spent her days caring for his young daughter, entirely unaware that what he was about to discover would completely shatter his worldview. 3 months earlier, Rachel used to wake up at exactly 5 in the morning in her small rented house in the distant suburbs of the city. Her daily routine was always the same rigid sequence. She would prepare a modest breakfast, carefully pack her worn backpack, and then catch 2 different buses just to reach the affluent coastal neighborhoods. She had worked diligently as a professional nanny for 8 years, always securing impeccable references from her previous employers due to her unwavering dedication. She was known to be affectionate, strictly punctual, and never once gave any family a single reason to issue a complaint regarding her stellar performance. When the elite employment agency finally recommended her to Edward Miller, Rachel felt a deep wave of apprehension wash over her tired spirit. Jobs in beachfront mansions, owned by wealthy businessmen, always seemed to come with unreasonably difficult demands and a severe lack of personal empathy. However, she desperately needed the employment, as the essential medications she relied on to keep her world together were becoming increasingly expensive with each passing month. The massive 3-story estate faced the beautiful ocean, boasting a heated infinity pool and an immensely manicured garden that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Rachel swallowed the nervous lump in her throat as she rang the brass doorbell on that bright Tuesday morning, waiting for her new boss. Edward opened the heavy wooden door. He was 38 years old, with distinguished silver hair at his temples and the exhausted eyes of a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. A grieving widower for 2 years, he was entirely alone in raising his 6-year-old daughter, Isabella, who had been deeply affected by the tragic loss. "Are you always this punctual? I appreciate that quality," he stated flatly, his face completely devoid of any welcoming smile or warmth. "I have always been punctual, sir," Rachel replied respectfully, following him up the grand sweeping staircase to meet the little girl who would become her charge. They found Isabella sitting quietly on the bedroom floor, completely surrounded by expensive dolls that she stared at with utter heartbreaking disinterest. The young girl had messy brown hair tied into uneven braids, and her large, expressive eyes seemed completely drained of their natural childhood sparkle. Rachel knelt down softly and whispered her name, but the grieving child remained frozen, offering absolutely no response to the gentle greeting. During the first few weeks, the daily work environment proved to be incredibly difficult and emotionally draining for the newly hired caretaker. Isabella barely spoke a single word, picked endlessly at her expensive meals, and lived entirely locked away within her own isolated world of sorrow. Edward constantly observed everything from a safe distance, maintaining a strictly serious and emotionally distant posture that made the massive house feel incredibly cold. Rachel could easily sense that he did not trust her completely, his guarded eyes tracking her every movement, but she maintained a boundless well of patience. She continually spoke to Isabella in soothing tones, even when the quiet girl offered absolutely no verbal response to the gentle one-sided conversations. Rachel creatively prepared colorful and engaging meals, invented quiet indoor games, and slowly the little girl began to offer tiny, hesitant smiles. Those small smiles eventually blossomed into genuine laughter, and for the first time in 2 painful years, Edward realized his daughter was finally coming back to life. "Do you have a special gift with children?" he asked one morning, casually adding, "Do you have any children of your own?" Rachel's silence stretched out for exactly 3 seconds longer than a normal conversation would naturally dictate, creating a thick tension in the grand kitchen. "No, sir. I have never had children." She finally answered, her voice trembling just a fraction of an inch before she quickly looked away. Edward sharply caught the obvious hesitation in her quiet voice, but he chose not to press the delicate issue any further at that moment. Still, something deeply unsettling about that specific answer remained echoing in the back of his mind, quietly planting a tiny seed of persistent doubt. Everything had been functioning beautifully in the grand estate until the unexpected arrival of their very first Friday afternoon together. It was exactly 5 o'clock when Rachel approached Edward in his expansive home office, nervously clutching the worn straps of her canvas bag. "Mr. Miller, I urgently need to leave my shift a little bit early today, if you would be so kind as to allow it." Edward immediately frowned, sharply reminding her that their strict contractual agreement clearly stated she was required to stay until 7 o'clock every single evening. "I am fully aware, and I sincerely apologize, but it is a highly personal matter that I must attend to," she pleaded with wide eyes. "It will only happen on Fridays, and I am more than willing to make up the lost hours on any other day of the week." Edward deeply disliked the frantic rush evident in her eyes and the anxious trembling of her hands, but he reluctantly offered his stiff agreement. Rachel practically sprinted out the front door at 5:15, leaving Edward staring out the massive window, wondering where she was rushing to. Those strange, abbreviated Friday schedules repeated themselves without fail, week after week, like a deeply frustrating clockwork routine that Edward could not control. Every single week, promptly at 5 in the afternoon, Rachel would nervously ask to leave the mansion early, and every week Edward's dark suspicion grew. He frantically tried to convince his logical brain that it was absolutely nothing sinister, but his protective paternal instincts simply refused to be silenced. What if she was secretly working a second job, or worse, involved in dangerous activities that could eventually bring harm to his vulnerable household? Isabella had grown profoundly attached to her kind nanny, eagerly calling for her every morning and weeping softly whenever it was time for her to leave. Edward knew he absolutely could not risk allowing a potentially untrustworthy individual to become a permanent fixture in his fragile daughter's recovering heart. By the time the 5th Friday rolled around, Edward finally made a firm decision to put an end to the agonizing mystery once and for all. He sternly ordered Rachel to remain at the house until 7 o'clock, claiming he had an urgent business meeting that could not be easily rescheduled. Rachel instantly grew entirely pale, her voice violently shaking as she begged him to let her go, just for this one specific evening. Edward crossed his arms defensively and demanded to know exactly where she went every Friday, refusing to accept another vague excuse about personal matters. Tears rapidly pooled in the corners of Rachel's eyes as she pleaded for his blind trust, promising that her secret did not compromise her job. Edward let out a bitter, cynical laugh, firmly stating that trust had to be earned, especially when his daughter's emotional well-being was on the line. Seeing her utter desperation, he tensely nodded his dismissal, watching as she literally ran down the long driveway toward the distant bus stop. That night, Edward desperately called a private investigator he knew, hoping to pay the man to follow the secretive nanny and uncover the truth. Unfortunately, the seasoned investigator coldly informed him that he had zero availability for the next 3 weeks, which felt like an absolute eternity. The agonizing doubt was violently consuming his peace of mind, leading him to confidently declare to his sister on the phone that Rachel was hiding something terrible. His sister Patricia, a highly successful and deeply cynical corporate lawyer, suggested that perhaps the woman simply desired a normal level of personal privacy. Privacy is an entirely different concept from a dark hidden secret. Edward argued, fiercely convinced that his protective paranoia was entirely justified. The following Friday, completely unable to bear the heavy weight of his own relentless curiosity, Edward firmly decided he would personally shadow her every move. At 10 minutes to 5, he pretended to leave for an executive meeting, strategically parking his car 2 streets down to patiently wait for her departure. He stealthily followed the public transit bus through the congested Miami streets, his heart violently hammering against his ribs as 40 minutes slowly ticked by. The second bus finally came to a grinding halt in front of the aged regional hospital, a towering concrete structure with peeling beige paint. Edward parked his car in a total daze, a massive wave of crushing guilt hitting his chest as he assumed she must be battling a terrible disease. He wandered through the crowded, chaotic corridors smelling of strong antiseptic, eventually finding her openly weeping outside the restricted pediatric intensive care unit. Edward stood entirely frozen in the sterile hospital corridor, feeling as though the solid floor had abruptly vanished from beneath his expensive leather shoes. A compassionate nurse dressed in pale blue scrubs gently approached Rachel and placed a comforting hand on her trembling shoulder, whispering words of encouragement. Rachel hastily wiped the continuous stream of tears from her flushed cheeks and bravely pushed through the heavy double doors into the restricted medical ward. Edward remained stranded alone in the brightly lit hallway, his heart racing wildly as a single agonizing question echoed repeatedly through his mind. Who in the world was lying inside that pediatric intensive care unit fighting for their life, while he arrogantly worried about broken schedules? He could not bring himself to physically move forward, feeling the crushing weight of his immense guilt, physically restricting the air in his lungs. Children were in there, fighting impossible battles, and Rachel was clearly carrying a burden vastly larger and heavier than his cynical mind had ever imagined. He slowly backed away from the imposing double doors, entirely lacking the necessary courage to selfishly invade such a profoundly intimate and painful moment. He drove his vehicle back to the sprawling coastal mansion on pure autopilot, his mind spinning frantically with endless unanswerable questions about her secret life. Was the mysterious patient a young nephew, or perhaps the child she had previously claimed she never had during their initial conversation in the kitchen? That night, little Isabella asked for her beloved Rachel 3 separate times before finally drifting off to sleep, and each innocent question felt like a blade. Edward swallowed hard, tightly wrapping his arms around his precious daughter, feeling an overwhelming surge of protective love and deep, shameful regret for his actions. By the time Saturday morning dawned over the shimmering ocean, Edward found that he absolutely could not endure the oppressive silence of his own thoughts. He returned to the busy hospital, quietly passing by the main reception desk and taking the rattling elevator all the way to the 3rd floor. He carefully observed from a distance as Rachel sat rigidly in a plastic corridor chair, her hands tightly clasped together in a silent, desperate prayer. Edward drew a deep, steadying breath, knowing he absolutely needed to speak with her, and slowly walked toward the grieving mother in the lonely hallway. Rachel lifted her exhausted red-rimmed eyes and instantly froze in pure terror upon seeing her wealthy employer standing out of place in the public hospital. Her face drained of all remaining color as she hastily stood up, frantically brushing away the fresh tears that stained her tired, beautiful face. "I followed you yesterday, and I am profoundly sorry for crossing that line," Edward admitted softly, his voice much gentler than he had originally intended. Rachel tightly closed her eyes, her entire body trembling like a fragile leaf in a storm, whispering that he had absolutely no right to do so. "I know I had no right, but I needed to understand the truth, and now I beg you to explain." Edward pleaded with genuine sincerity. Rachel looked agonizingly back at the heavy doors of the intensive care unit before turning her completely devastated gaze back to meet his expectant eyes. "He is my beautiful son," she finally whispered into the quiet space, confirming the exact truth that Edward had most intensely feared to hear. Edward felt all the oxygen violently leave his lungs, stammering that she had previously told him she never had any children of her own. A single heavy tear escaped and rolled slowly down Rachel's cheek as she confessed that she always lied because the painful truth was simply unbearable. "How long has your little boy been residing in this hospital?" Edward asked desperately, leaning against the cold hallway wall for much-needed physical support. 3.5 years, she replied, her voice breaking entirely, as she revealed her son Michael was currently 8 years old and trapped in a coma. A severe cerebral infection had ravaged his young brain at the tender age of 4, leaving him permanently asleep despite the doctor's most desperate efforts. She explained that she visited every Friday because it was the only possible day she could manage, while tirelessly working to pay his massive medical bills. She tearfully described how she read to him and told him endless stories about Isabella, desperately needing to believe that his sleeping mind could hear her. Edward felt a massive choking knot form tightly in his throat, realizing his foolish paranoia had completely blinded him to her unimaginable daily suffering. Rachel finally asked if he wanted to meet the boy, leading him inside the room where he silently vowed to somehow make things right. When Monday morning finally arrived, Rachel walked up the long, winding driveway of the beachfront estate with an incredibly heavy, anxious heart beating in her chest. She had absolutely no idea what to expect from her employer. Though he had been remarkably kind at the hospital, businessmen often changed their minds swiftly. She fearfully anticipated that he might instantly terminate her employment for lying to his face during her initial interview regarding her personal family history. She rang the doorbell with trembling fingers, and Edward quickly opened the grand door, his handsome face looking just as intensely serious as it always did. "Rachel, I desperately need to speak with you in private before you begin your daily tasks with Isabella," Edward stated firmly, pointing toward his office. Her stomach violently twisted into nervous knots as she followed him into the spacious room, entirely prepared to receive her final paycheck and a harsh dismissal. Instead, Edward slowly picked up a thick folder of medical documents, resting on his mahogany desk, tapping the smooth paper with his fingers. "I spent my entire weekend thoroughly researching your son's specific medical case, consulting with several highly respected pediatric neurologists across the country," he began quietly. He carefully opened the folder, revealing detailed brochures about a highly advanced experimental neurological treatment program currently being conducted at a premier facility in New York. This unique therapy does not guarantee he will wake up, but it has shown miraculous results in improving brain function and reducing severe physical damage. Rachel widened her tired eyes, admitting she already knew about the famous treatment, but confessed it cost over $200,000 for the first 6 months. Edward smoothly slid a formally drafted financial agreement across the desk toward her, looking her directly in the eyes and firmly stating that he would pay. The crisp paper slipped entirely from Rachel's shaking hands, fluttering gently to the floor as she gasped in pure shock, adamantly refusing to accept his charity. "It is an astronomical amount of money, sir, and I would absolutely never be able to repay such a massive debt in my entire lifetime." Edward stepped around the large desk and grasped her shoulders with surprising gentleness, declaring that he never wanted a single penny paid back to him. He desperately wanted her to experience the profound gift of hope, and he deeply wanted young Michael to have a genuine fighting chance at life. Rachel completely collapsed against his chest, sobbing uncontrollably with a fierce intensity she had not allowed herself to openly release in many long, grueling years. Edward stood silently, letting her cry out the massive accumulation of grief, without an ounce of judgment, gently patting her shaking back with immense compassion. "Why in the world are you doing this for us?" she managed to ask between heavy, breathless sobs, looking up at his remarkably calm face. Edward remained completely silent for a long moment, his own throat tightening painfully, before he finally shared the darkest, most agonizing regret of his past. He revealed that when his beloved wife was battling an incredibly aggressive cancer 2 years ago, he hesitated to fund an experimental and wildly expensive treatment. He tragically believed it was far too risky and too costly, and by the time he finally agreed to proceed, the cruel disease had advanced too far. She passed away just 3 weeks later, and I am forced to live with that suffocating, poisonous regret every single day of my miserable life. He firmly swore he would absolutely never allow Rachel to endure that same horrifying pain of knowing she had not tried every conceivable medical option. In the ensuing weeks, the established routine within the grand mansion changed dramatically, transforming the previously somber household into a bright beacon of relentless hope. Edward not only financed the exorbitant treatment, but brilliantly orchestrated Michael's complex medical transport to the specialized clinic located in the bustling heart of New York. He generously hired an elite team of private nurses, ensuring Rachel could comfortably spend 3 days every week by her precious son's bedside without losing income. He even significantly increased her standard salary to seamlessly cover all of her additional living expenses, aggressively refusing to let her call his actions overly generous. Even on the most difficult days when the complex therapy seemed to yield no visible results, Rachel returned to Miami with a bright, beautiful smile. One lazy afternoon, while Isabella was happily drawing in the sunlit living room, she innocently asked why her favorite nanny sometimes looked so profoundly sad. Rachel knelt beside the sweet girl, explaining that she deeply missed her brave little boy, who was resting in a distant hospital, fighting to get better. Isabella thoughtfully handed over her crayon drawing of a bright yellow sun, demanding Rachel give it to Michael to make him strong, bringing them to tears. The fragile peace that had settled over the beautiful coastal mansion was abruptly shattered on a rainy Thursday afternoon by the unannounced arrival of Edward's sister. Patricia, a famously ruthless corporate attorney, known for her deeply cynical view of humanity, stormed through the front doors, demanding an immediate, strictly private audience. She aggressively locked the heavy oak doors of Edward's private study, pacing the Persian rug like a caged predator ready to strike down her chosen prey. "Have you completely lost your absolute mind, giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to a glorified babysitter?" She hissed, her eyes blazing with absolute fury. Edward firmly defended Rachel's honor, insisting that the massive financial support was strictly for her critically ill son, and that Patricia simply did not understand. "You barely even know this mysterious woman, Edward. Has it never occurred to your grieving mind that she might be expertly manipulating your vulnerable emotions?" Patricia relentlessly argued that a profoundly sad sob story paired with perfectly timed tears was the ultimate, classic formula for stealing wealth from a lonely widower. Edward felt a burning wave of protective anger violently rise in his chest, angrily reminding his sister that Rachel had never actually asked for a single dime. Patricia let out a deeply frustrated sigh, begging her stubborn brother to at least demand official medical records to confirm the elaborate tragedy was genuinely real. Edward remained completely silent, not because he genuinely doubted Rachel's pure heart, but because his sister's venomous words had successfully planted a tiny, toxic seed. He violently hated himself for letting the dark suspicion creep back into his fragile mind, leading to an entirely sleepless night filled with agonizing mental torment. The dreadful echoing of Patricia's harsh warnings bounced endlessly off the walls of his dark bedroom, twisting his genuine acts of kindness into foolish naivety. The very next morning, deeply ashamed of his own weakness, Edward made a highly discreet phone call directly to the pediatric ward of the regional hospital. He desperately tried to verify the exact length of Michael's extended stay, but the stern receptionist adamantly refused to release confidential medical information without proper authorization. Unable to let the burning doubt consume him entirely, Edward drove his luxury car back to the hospital, desperately seeking out anyone willing to speak. An elderly physician named Dr. Harrison eventually approached him proudly, confirming that Rachel was an absolute saint who had never missed a single Friday in years. Dr. Harrison spoke with immense reverence about her fierce independence, noting she always aggressively refused charity because she never wanted to be seen as a victim. Edward drove back to the oceanfront estate, feeling a profound, crushing sense of self-loathing, wondering how he could have ever let Patricia's toxic paranoia infect him. However, his hard-won mental peace was instantly obliterated merely 2 days later when Patricia confidently returned to the mansion, violently slamming a thick yellow envelope onto his desk. "Since you cowardly refused to hire a professional investigator, I took the absolute liberty of doing it myself to protect this family's immense wealth," she announced. Edward opened the sealed envelope with violently trembling hands, his stomach dropping into a bottomless pit as he stared at the glossy surveillance photographs hidden inside. The crisp images clearly showed Rachel happily walking into a premium commercial real estate building and warmly shaking hands with a sharply dressed real estate agent. Another incredibly damning photo captured her happily receiving a thick stack of official property documents while touring a luxurious modern apartment in the center of town. Patricia triumphantly pointed at the pictures, cruelly announcing that the humble nanny was currently purchasing a luxury property worth exactly $300,000. She might truly have a sick child, but she is absolutely siphoning your generous medical funds to buy herself a beautiful new life," Patricia whispered venomously. Edward collapsed heavily into his leather office chair, completely devastated by the overwhelming visual evidence, feeling utterly betrayed by the woman he had slowly learned to admire. When Rachel cheerfully returned to the estate at exactly 2 in the afternoon, after picking Isabella up from her private school, Edward was silently waiting. He coldly dismissed Isabella to her playroom and locked the study doors, throwing the scattered photographs across the desk and demanding an immediate, truthful explanation. Rachel stared at the glossy photos in absolute horror, her face turning ashen as she desperately tried to comprehend the devastating accusation being hurled at her. Through violent, heavy sobs, she explained that her beloved father had unexpectedly passed away exactly 2 months ago, leaving her an inheritance of $150,000. She swore on her son's life that Edward's medical money remained entirely untouched, explaining she merely wanted to buy a permanent home for Michael's hopeful return. Deeply shattered by his complete lack of faith in her character, Rachel grabbed her canvas bag, abruptly resigned from her position, and ran crying from the house. That agonizing evening, Edward desperately attempted to call Rachel's cellular phone more than 10 different times, but every single call went straight to her automated voicemail. She absolutely, completely vanished from their daily lives, refusing to show up for work the following morning, leaving little Isabella crying inconsolably for her missing best friend. By the time Friday afternoon finally arrived, Edward could no longer endure the suffocating silence and hastily drove his car directly to the busy public hospital. He practically ran down the sterile corridors until he found Rachel sitting quietly in the intensive care unit, gently holding her sleeping son's fragile, pale hand. Edward slowly paused at the heavy doorway, taking a deep, ragged breath before cautiously stepping inside, feeling entirely like a trespasser in a deeply sacred space. "Rachel, I came here today to beg for your absolute forgiveness," he whispered into the quiet room, his voice shaking with genuine, overwhelming remorse. She completely ignored his presence, keeping her tear-filled eyes locked firmly on the steady, rhythmic rising and falling of young Michael's chest beneath the thin hospital blanket. Edward pulled up a plastic chair beside her, openly admitting that he had foolishly allowed his bitter sister's toxic paranoia to poison his mind and destroy their bond. "You simply do not trust anyone in this world." Edward Rachel finally spoke, using his given name for the very first time since they had met. She expressed how incredibly painful it was to be constantly treated like a manipulative opportunist, when all she had ever done was love her son unconditionally. She firmly stated she would absolutely never return to work in his massive home, desperately needing a peaceful environment completely free from his constant suffocating judgment. Edward felt hot tears aggressively prick his eyes as he begged her to consider Isabella's broken heart, pleading with her to finally accept them as true family. He frantically offered to completely remodel the entire ground floor of his beachfront estate, transforming it into a state-of-the-art medical suite with around-the-clock nursing care. He wanted her to move in permanently with Michael the moment the boy was stable enough to leave the hospital, refusing to let her fight entirely alone. "I absolutely cannot accept such monumental charity." Rachel wept quietly, but Edward firmly grabbed her trembling hand, fiercely declaring that his offer was based on pure love. Suddenly, in the midst of their emotional reconciliation, a genuine miracle occurred as Michael's tiny fingers visibly twitched weakly, but deliberately squeezing his sobbing mother's hand. Rachel gasped loudly, her eyes widening in absolute shock, as the young boy's fingers moved a second time, sending an electric jolt of hope through the room. Edward instantly shouted for the medical staff, and Dr. Harrison came sprinting down the hallway to rapidly check the various monitors and examine the fragile patient. "This is a confirmed voluntary motor response," the elderly doctor announced with absolute astonishment, noting it was his very first deliberate movement in over 3.5 years. Rachel completely collapsed into Edward's strong arms, violently weeping tears of absolute joy, while Edward finally allowed his guarded heart to believe that magnificent miracles truly exist. Exactly 3 years later, the grand Miami beachfront estate was completely transformed into a joyous festival of life, brimming with brightly colored balloons and endless laughter. Children ran wildly across the manicured green lawns, while 9-year-old Isabella happily directed the chaotic party games with the confident authority of a beloved older sister. Sitting proudly in the center of the beautiful patio, in a custom wheelchair, was 11-year-old Michael, smiling brightly at the wonderful chaos unfolding around him. It had taken 8 grueling months of painful physical therapy for him to finally wake up, slowly relearning how to speak swallow and recognize his family's faces. Rachel stood happily by his side, adjusting a napkin on his lap, her beautiful face radiating a profound, absolute peace that had been absent for a decade. Edward cheerfully walked over carrying a massive chocolate birthday cake, proudly declaring that the honored birthday boy was about to receive the biggest slice of the evening. After the children had happily retreated to the shallow end of the swimming pool, Rachel sat quietly next to Edward on the wooden porch, resting her head on his shoulder. She softly thanked him for giving them a brand new life. But Edward gently corrected her, insisting they had magnificently saved each other from a life of lonely darkness. As Edward stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the Miami horizon, painting the sky in strokes of gold and violet, he reflected on the incredible journey that brought them together. He realized that true wealth is not measured by the size of a beachfront estate or the numbers in a bank account, but by the capacity to open our hearts to the pain of others. Life often tests us with shadows of doubt and fear, urging us to build walls to protect our fragile emotions. Yet, it is only when we choose vulnerability over cynicism, when we extend a hand of grace without demanding a receipt, that we truly begin to live. The greatest mistakes we make are usually born from an unwillingness to trust, while our most profound blessings emerge from the courage to believe in the goodness of another human being. Healing does not happen in isolation. It requires the warmth of shared burdens and the quiet strength of forgiveness. A house only becomes a sanctuary when it is filled with second chances, reminding us all that love, when freely given, has the miraculous power to awaken even the most dormant parts of our souls.